Now, I started this project in 1968. I was doing a master's thesis on the Dawes General Allotment Act of 1887. Okay? And so I went to Philadelphia and I looked at the Indian Rights Association, and I went to Haverford and to the collections of the Friends, the Philadelphia Friends, and I wrote a master's thesis. So I come up here ready, about to get my doctorate, applying for a job. And all of a sudden, during the negotiations, or the interview, if you want to call it that, they say to me, we see that you did a lot of undergraduate and graduate work on Native Americans, or whether it's in Latin American history or in US history. You did all research on that, and your master's thesis was on that. You think you could teach a course on Native Americans? This was 1971. This was in May of 1971. And I said, yeah, of course. I needed the job. And okay. And of course, I knew about Mohonk, because of all the records that I went through, which were extensive. And by October of 1971, I had the privilege of meeting A. Smiley, one of the founders and owners of this hotel. His name was A. Keith Smiley. He was a gentleman, and he influenced my life. He really influenced my life. And he was very concerned about the past of Mohonk. And he told me about Mohonk, both the positive and negative sides of its history. Okay? Of course, the greatness of this hotel, besides being a hotel, is the International Arbitration Conferences that was the route, almost the indirect route to the United Nations. Because in 1915, the former president of the United States, all 350 pounds, okay, William Taft, gave a talk here in 1915. He was part of an organization called the League to Enforce Peace. He was a pacifist. Okay, he thought in terms of not strictly pacifism, but international arbitration to prevent conflict. Now, that doesn't make much sense in 1915 because there's a world war going on, right? But that movement had started in the 1890s, called the Hague movement, the Hague, Das Hague, whatever. And that led to what now is the International Court of Justice. Okay, but that Hague movement actually gained its impetus here, with all of these famous diplomats from all over the world, from Asia to Latin America, coming here from 1895 to 1915, 16. Then what happened, of course, when the United States went to war in April of 1917, that's the end of that, right? That's the end of the international arbitration movement, too, until, of course, you had to pick up the pieces during World War II at Bretton Woods and places like that, another hotel, to establish the United Nations. But Mr. Smiley, Keith Smiley, said to me, he said, you know that U Thant would come here. I said, yeah, the Secretary General, Secretariat. I said, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, in the 1950s, they would talk about the International Policekeeping Force here. I was intrigued. I was asked to participate with a fellow named a professor from Ohio, who was a friend of Keith Smiley, to do a series of, to put the microcards of the conferences, not just the international arbitration conferences, but the Native American conferences. And the other third one was called the Negro question. Okay. Yes, if you look at it today, they're embarrassing, some of them, right? But I'm sure looking back at a lot of history, it's embarrassing too, you know? I mean, think about looking at it from South Dakota in 1890, you know? I mean, geez, you know, or even today in some parts of South Dakota, okay? Or what we see today. We have certain things today that we're embarrassed by, right? Okay, so, but that is the greatness of the place. But they tried to do something that they weren't capable of doing, and that was this. But some of the things that they did, beside allotment, were things that influenced Michelle's people directly, in a more positive sense than allotment. Obviously, allotment was a failure. Okay, we're not going to. We'll talk about that. It's a failure, and also people should have known earlier that it was a failure. Okay, but you see this lady here in this picture. This lady here. She's directly connected to Michelle's people. Without this lady, there would not be a lace-making tradition in her people. Okay? This Sybil Carter was from Louisiana. She lost her family fortune during the Civil War. They burned a plantation. And so she devoted the rest of her life to missionary work, especially in Minnesota. From Minnesota, she came to Oneida. She established 10 different lace-making industries within Native American communities, Northern European lace-making, right? She saw the skill of Native American women in terms of the beadwork and basket making and various other artistic endeavors. And she said, hey, you know, they could make some money to support some of their other activities on the reservation, family activities. And the women, including the people I know on the reservation at Oneida, looked fondly about this collection because their grandmothers all did it. 150 women, 150 women, and a few men who did the transportation aspect or the packing aspects of it, okay? And it came out, and people in New York City, they set up a place in New York City for distribution and sales of the, but as you'll see in one of the slides, the opening of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and whose art is highlighted? The Oneidas of Wisconsin. I had the privilege of being shown that the altarpieces, 25 altarpieces, by the vicar of the great cathedral. I said, well, I'll go and look at it, you know, whatever. You know, I just decided to, I mean, this is kind of interesting. How does lace from Northern European lace made by a group of native people end up as being the featured art at the opening of the cathedral in April of 1911? Okay, whatever. My Native American name, he straightens the words that the Seneca gave me. That Seneca's in 2011. And, but the picture here, this was given to me by Patty Madison there. And she shouldn't be yelled at or criticized for giving me the picture. After all, you know, who's telling the story? You know what I mean? And she always appreciated everything I did, and still does. So, as I mentioned, I encountered Mohonk on my half-century journey through Six Nations country, Haudenosaunee country, Iroquois country, almost from the beginning. And these are the two people here at Mohonk that influenced me in my interest in Mohonk and in my interest in this period of time, which really my specialty is really from the Civil War to the present, basically, in my writings, you know, over the time. And almost all of them deal with Oneidas and Senecas. Okay. That's Keith and Ruth smiling. Iroquois today, you know, I see we think the Kurds are transnational people, right? We say, well, they're in Iraq, they're in Turkey, they're in Iran, Okay, they're all over the, they're in Syria, right? Okay, well, how come we don't think of these people as transnational people? I mean, Michelle told me she has relatives here. Right, okay, and I've been, in order to do research, you had to go both to Canada and the United States. You had to cross the border. The Mohawks say they crawl under the line. They hate it so much. They crawl under the line. Like, they're like little, like a flock of sheep going across the line. It's, it cuts that reservation, Akwesasne, right, the river cuts the reservation. The border cuts the reservation. Okay. All right. So not shown in Western, you'll see Oneida later. Okay. You don't see the Wisconsin Oneida there. Okay. Mr. Smiley, Keith Smiley, was interested in this disaster. He and the Friends Committee on National Legislation were organized in the late 50s and early 60s to fight this dam. It took 10,000 acres of land. Smiley, based here. You heard the Hauptman story, you didn't hear this story. Right? Yes, the Quakers were the friends of the Senecas in the 1960s, early 60s. Right? 10,000 acres flooded because of, surprisingly, the Democrat president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. For Native people, it doesn't often make much of a difference between the two parties in terms of federal policies, okay? You gotta understand that. Today, yes, okay? Today, yes. I'm not gonna say that today doesn't matter, okay? One of the people that, a Native person here, and many other Native people, were part of what's called the outing system. They worked in this hotel. They worked in the hotel. They were sent from Hampton Institute, like Reverend Owl, who I knew very well. They were sent here to learn from the rich, well-born, and able people that attended in the hotel, okay? But this man was exceptional. I knew him. He was in his 80s when I knew him, and I knew him well, okay? Yes, I did know him well. And I knew his daughter well, Betty. They were friends of mine. Okay. Reverend Al created the sports program at Mohonk. He should be on a picture on that wall. How long have I said that? 20 years?
Yes.
Okay.
No, probably longer.
Yeah, probably longer. Okay. Reverend Al was a Baptist minister, missionary at the Cattaraugus Seneca Reservation when I first did field work at Cattaraugus in Western New York. I knew him. He was an athlete. He almost broke my hand as an 85-year-old man. He was a baseball player. His family were Major League Baseball players. But he was a minister. He was one of the most famous graduates of Hampton Institute. He was head of the Hampton Institute Native Alumni Association. Okay, great man. And important for the history of this hotel. In 1983, we held the 100th anniversary of the Lake Mohonk Conferences of Friends of the Indian. And we brought all kinds of different people here, Native people, non-Native people, academics, ministers, whatever, educators, okay? Maybe 200 people, a little less than 200 people, okay? And, but they were commemorating, not celebrating, they were commemorating the 1883 conference. And they were examining it in the context of both good and bad, okay? That's what they were. Here's my friend, my dear friend, Gordy McLester, right there. Okay. He and I wrote 5 books together. I was anointed. I was actually, he meant a lot to me, a lot. It means a lot to Michelle as well. This is the 1983 conference when there were in attendance were at least 85 Native Americans. I could point them out if I had better, if I expanded the picture, I could point them all out. Okay. Yeah. There I am with my friend, my dear friend, my golf partner, Roy Black, Mohonk, Seneca. Mohonk, Seneca. We used to do field work together, golf. But a great man, great man. The most prominent Native Americans who attended the Lake Mohonk Conferences from 1883 to 1916, and then again in 1929. Notice, of course, you know, right away the attitude is the attitude of the times. The images and the stereotypes that Native people had faced over hundreds of years. They had to be led. They were dependent people that had to be led. They were not equal, but they should become citizens. See, they should live like everybody else in America on individual parcels and have title to those parcels. That's it. They should leave the reservation behind and end up working in the cities, for example, like Detroit and Milwaukee, okay, and Chicago, where most Oneidas went, by the way, under the allotment policies. Notice an Oneida. Oh, you recognize the name. The great inventor. He had 3 patents. This man was a genius, okay? He was from New York, okay? But his relatives were in Wisconsin. He used to visit them, okay? He went to Wisconsin, and on the way back, he stopped in Chicago and enlisted in the United States Navy. A graduate of Hampton Institute, he was a scientist. He was an inventor, okay? Prominent. He worked for Thomas Edison. That's hardly childlike, okay? Hardly child. He worked up in Schenectady at that great emporium of Thomas Edison, which is no more, unfortunately. They seem to skip out of town every 20 years, you know. Okay, Chapman Skinner, but his relative was Willie Fat Skenendore, very famous Oneida in the 1920s and 1930s, who was an advocate of land claims. He was an advocate of treaty rights. He was a peculiar fellow. He used to carry law books with him. Fat guy carrying his law books across the reservation. People would make fun. What are you doing carrying all those heavy law books? You know? But that was Willie Fat. To younger people who remembered him, he was memorable because he kept things alive about litigation, about rights, about sovereignty. Important. That was his relative. So he would go and visit him. Okay, there were others. One of the most famous of all Native Americans of the 20th century, Zikla Shah. Okay, she's, you know, American Indian Stories. I used to use it as a book in my Native American history course. Yeah, she was here. Okay, Redbird, you know, and as it says, one of the great outstanding writers of the 20th century. Okay, I like that picture a lot. Charles Eastman, one of the third Native American to graduate Dartmouth. Okay, he graduated Dartmouth, and he ended up at the time of Wounded Knee, taking care of those that survived. Yeah, Charles Eastman. His books in the early 20th century were bestsellers. They were popular, just like, you know, the Boy Scouts, in terms of the Boy Scout image, the importance of the Boy Scouts. And he stressed natural history and the like, So he was an extraordinary man. He was a doctor as well. He was married to a missionary lady. These people were all here. That's what I'm trying to bring out. All of them were here. And when you talk about Angel Decorah, she was notice a Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. I had to put her in there, but she was really one of the major artists in the boarding schools, and influenced the art direction, Native American art, in the early 1900s in the boarding schools. This one, most people, she's not. She gets attention in Mohonk histories, Alice Robertson, Burgess, Larry Burgess's history. She gets attention. She's notice she was the first woman in the state's history to be elected to Congress, Oklahoma Creek. And also remember, we're talking about diversity of Native American people too, not just they had different attitudes. She was a Republican conservative at that time, like of course, the present congressman from Oklahoma. I can't think of his name. Tom, whatever. Okay, but there's who's basically a Chickasaw. I can't think of his name right now. Okay. There was, of course, the radical side of people who came to Mohonk. Wasaja. Wasaja is, of course, if you looked at it, is Carlos Montezuma, who was what he advocated from the after World War I. He advocated basically destroying the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He was a radical who believed that obviously the Native Americans should be left alone, that there are too many rules and regulations. That doesn't mean that if you take those rules and regulations away, they will be protected. But he believed that you have to start all over again. Wasaja, okay. He was very, very influential in the 1920s. He was here. Francis LaFleche from the Smithsonian Institute, he was here. Francis LaFleche, an Omaha ethnologist who worked at the Smithsonian, okay, the Bureau of American Ethnology, with Alice Fletcher, the anthropologist, which is interesting, by the way, it's an interesting book, Indian Schoolboys, The Middle Five. You might know his sisters, Susan and Suzette LaFleche, very prominent women in Native American history. This is a very fine man. Henry Rocloud, he worked within the system. He saw the failures of allotment, okay? He was here. He saw the failures of allotment. And then he worked with the Roosevelt administration, the Indian New Deal, to overturn the policy. Yeah, he was a mild-mannered person who worked within the system. And of course, the Indian New Deal represented for Michelle's people here, they had like 2,200 acres of land left after 65,400 acres that were allotted, okay, and taken. The New Deal, they had 90, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. They had 90 acres of tribal lands, and they had 700 acres of allotted non-dispersed lands, okay? That's what they had in 1934. By 1938, 1940, they had 2,400 acres of land because of what's called rehabilitating submarginal lands. That's what it was called, the submarginal project of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Okay. But he's a person who never gets enough attention. Happened to be a graduate of Yale. Right. He's not the first. It happened before, And Hoskinson, you see, look at me. Obviously, you can see that the more financially attuned people presented here seem to be from Oklahoma, which is true today. Oklahoma Native people are a little different. Yes, they are different, but that's fine. Everybody has a different side. Arthur Parker, who was not an enrolled Seneca, but was of Seneca ancestry, related. His relative was Ely Parker, General Ely Parker of the Civil War. But he was unenrolled, but he produced some of the best works on the Haudenosaunee people. The origins of Lake Mohonk Conference of Friends of the Indian. See? Let's go to the origins. Now we saw the scope. We saw how I got involved. Now we look what's happening. Why do they come to Mohonk in 1883? Well, there's a reason. Not only the beauty, we have to understand that the two founders of this hotel, okay, were teachers at the Moses Brown School in Providence, Rhode Island. They were not the wealthiest people, but what happened is they started buying land, and then they had to pay for the land, so they opened a hotel. And they bought more land once the hotel was successful. Once they got a reputation of having presidents and secretaries of state, it became somewhat prosperous until World War I, of course, when things declined economically. But Moses Brown, so yes, they were Quakers. They were conservative Quakers, yes, from Philadelphia, yes. They were, I guess they would be Hicksites, not Orthodox. They were Hicksites. And the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Friends, that's really the basis of it. And what happened is, look at what is happening. You think we have problems today? Look at what Native people are faced with from 1864 to 1880. That's one after the other. Okay? And okay, just like people are concerned about things today, humanity today, and are upset by, obviously, war and politics and whatever. That's why they met here. And of course, the two brothers, Albert primarily, but Alfred as well, offered the hotel for these conferences. They were members of the Indian Rights Association of Philadelphia, where I worked. I actually worked there back in the early 80s. That's how, whatever. I did the conference for them. The last conference that the Indian Rights Association ever did. I was a coordinator with Vine Deloria, and we both did that. Okay, in any case. So some American Indian, well, you could see it. I mean, and so this was an emergency. You know, you had to, why, for example, was allotment then? It had been talked about for 100 years. In Wisconsin, the Brotherton Native people, the Brothertons, who are not federally recognized today, unfortunately, but the Brothertons, they were made citizens in 1839, and the land was allotted. Allotment was not new. Michigan, the allotment in Michigan occurred in the 1850s. Okay, so you had these Sharpies coming to the conference. Some of them were not necessarily the most upstanding moral people. And you had all these religious people, missionaries and teachers and educators, you know, and concerned people, yeah, absolutely, and you know, who knew nothing about what's going on out there. And of course, what was floated was allotment. After all, after 25 years of the Dawes Act, you could sell your land. The native people could sell their land, and if they don't have money and they're poor, what are they going to? You know, how are they going to survive? How is their families going to survive, right? See, so what I'm getting at is that this is the background. This is the background. And this was a crisis. Yes, it was a crisis. I mean, look, it was a crisis as late as 1890 with Wounded Knee. This was a crisis. The Apaches, the people here advocated that the Apaches were made prisoners of war in the 1880s. Who came to their defense? Indian Rights Association. They came. Guess where they were locked up? They were locked up on Governor's Island, 2 of them. Okay, so this is the setting. You can't make it into a cartoon, as some historians do. That doesn't justify what happened. It just explains how they came to this stupid conclusion. Okay, and of course there's Albert Smiley and his brother. You know, I didn't get this from the archives. Okay, according to and this is what they believe. This is truly what they believe. And yes, were they naive? Yes. Were they naive? Yes, they were naive. They were, they believed in that the good of human beings and not what the railroad people wanted, you know? And that doesn't mean that they didn't make mistakes and they didn't have their own prejudices, which they did, because that's the way it was. And of course, with the people of a certain level, they could never see the people at a lower level as equals. This is the world of social Darwinism. This is the world of that becomes, in the early, in terms of disregard for immigrants. Okay, sounds familiar today. Unfortunately, some of the same type of stuff, but this is their belief. And I love this. This is one of my favorite. Oh, definitely. In 2019, in the statuary hall that was desecrated in 2021, okay, the state of Nebraska put this statue up, standing there. It's the only Native American statue in the statuary hall. Okay, they put it, and who did they take down? Who did Standing Bear, the great advocate of human rights? His story is too long to go into at this time, but his case is one of the great cases of Native American history, in which he says, just like just like our slave history in New Paltz, aren't I a man? He says, don't I have rights? That's what he says in court. Okay, because he went off the reservation to bury his son in tribal territory, going back from Oklahoma to Nebraska, Standing Bear. And so who did he replace in Nebraska? He replaced, of all people, William Jennings Bryan. They took William Jennings Bryan, put him in the basement, and they put Standing Bear up. By the way, a very appropriate statue. It's a beautiful statue, but it's a modern statue, 219. See, I don't believe that you should destroy monuments. The only monuments I believe in destroying are Ku Klux Klan statues. Everything else should remain, but next to it should be another statue to explain how bad the first statue is. Rename all the Confederate names on federal military installations. Get rid of them all. But don't wipe it off the records. It's still there, you know. Just make sure that the name is not formerly known as Fort Bragg, formerly known as Fort Hood, to the worst. Okay. I love that. Okay, and then of course, Patty, knows all of. She did her work a lot on this. Helen Hunt Jackson, wasn't here, but her book inspired the reformers that came here. Okay, and she's very important. Although she was more interested in talking about the past. For example, what happened to the Cherokees back in the 1830s than the immediate. She was a quite interesting person from Colorado. Okay, But she influenced the conferences. Why did they come here? Because of her. Because she galvanized the movement. She was one of them. She's not the only one, but she was the most important one to galvanize the movement. And here are two others that galvanized the movement. They were religious people. They were affiliated with the church, like Quentin and Bonnie, but these were two. And of course, as you know, the women sat upstairs and the men were downstairs. The men were doing the so-called dirty work, yeah, right? And the women were watching from the galleries. That's how it was. It was not, it's just the way that things worked at that time. And to some people today, it still works that way. I'm not going to get into that. Herbert Welsh was the Indian Rights Association who brought these conferences, who basically was the leader of the Indian Rights Association for at least a quarter century, and inspired and organized a lot of this movement that came to fruition at Mohonk. And the first conference there is in 1883 of Friends of the Indian, The Native Americans came to the conference, I think it was first was, I think, 1890. And then they started coming more. There were others that I didn't mention, though, Mohawks. And there was an Oneida, Denison Wheelock, the famous musician. Who was Denison Wheelock? Well, he was not such a nice person, I'll be honest with you. But Denison Wheelock was one of the great musicians of the late 19th and early 20th century. He's an Oneida from Wisconsin. Okay? He was the bandmaster at Carlisle and Haskell. The bandmaster. In 1900, his music was played at the World's Fair in Paris in 1900. His musicians in the Carlisle band received rave reviews at Carnegie Hall. Okay? When Sousa died around 1904, 1905, something like that, who was nominated to take his place for America's Finest for the President's Band? Who? Wheelock, Denison Wheelock. But he was an Indian, see, Indian. And of course, he didn't get it, right? But that's one of the reasons. He was that famous. He was that famous as a composer. His music you could find in the Smithsonian and in UCLA Music Library, for example, which I had the privilege of doing. We played his music. One of Gordy and my efforts was to organize the Green Bay musicians to play his music at one of Gordy's conferences. And I never heard such beautiful stuff. But he was also a rascal, sometimes just because you're artistically great, which you are, doesn't make you a thief. And the others have nothing to do with him today. Okay, whatever. Okay. But he was part of this generation, he was part of this world, okay? A world that was not recognized for its worth. Okay, the mindset and reality of the ERA, of the era, right? Influences affecting Mohonk Conferences. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Well, some reformers thought only in terms of citizenship. They only thought in terms of, but they looked at it from the framework of African Americans. Two, the Anglo-American world view of superiority. Remember, this is the world of colonialism all over Africa, all over Asia, right? So you have to understand that is not a small thing. It's part of that mentality. Evolutionary anthropology, even academics talked about, social Darwinism, academics. Eugenics. By the turn of the century, it was eugenics. Right? Yeah, major American thinkers talked about eugenics. It's hard for me to say this, but the eugenics movement in the United States influenced Nazi Germany. Read about it, you'll see. Okay? Unfortunately, eugenics was a terrible, terrible situation. They examined heads of Native Americans to see if they're Native American enough, things like that. They denied Native American communities indigenous status largely because they didn't look Indian enough, so-called Indian enough. Right. I could get into that. But it's also, I don't like to call this period progressivism. It's not progressivism. Yeah, it's just not a progressive time period, the turn of the century. Look at immigration reform, immigration restrictions, right? By the 1920s, you have immigration restrictions. We might have them soon again. My daughter-in-law is waiting for legal citizenship for years today. Okay? She's from France. She doesn't have a cone head on, though. Okay. Some non-Indian conferees, Senator Henry Dawes, that's what he looked like. Yeah, Henry Dawes. Now, they were not, we give too much credit to politicians, for creating things. They all have people behind them influencing legislation, right? Whether today or in the past. To open up reservations under allotment would benefit certain companies, like railroads, right? Let's be honest. So when we look at this, we have to understand that, it's not just one evil individual. It's much more. And these individuals, of course, there was a level of deference to political leadership. Not so much today. I don't know. And of course, Richard Henry Pratt, a very misunderstood person. The Oneidas got along with Pratt. Yeah. See, why did they get along? Very interesting. Pratt didn't get along with the people here. His philosophy was totally against the Smileys, okay, against the idea of Mohonk and the conferences. Okay, he was not, because he believed in discipline. He believed in separation. Okay, it should be understood that he was on the frontier. He saw what was happening on the frontier to Native people. He understood Native people better than a lot of the people here because he had more contact with them. That doesn't mean that he didn't do things that were wrong or didn't do harm. It's just that he had much more knowledge and in some cases more respect from Native people than the reformers. Why do you think they went to Carlisle? They went to Carlisle. Oneidas, Senecas, and other Haudenosaunee people had hundreds of years of interaction with missionaries, right? Right? In the 1880s, they had 200 years of contact with missionaries, from the Jesuits to the Anglicans to the Presbyterians to the Methodists to the Episcopals. Okay? That's the Oneida situation. That's Oneida. Okay? They had exposure. More Oneidas could speak English. Senecas too. Okay? They had more educational background, although limited. So when they got to Carlisle or Hampton, they were not like Lakota, who couldn't speak a word of English. They weren't like Apaches, who couldn't speak a word of English. They were put on a different plane at those schools. In fact, there was basically a class system at these schools. That doesn't mean that they weren't mistreated. Okay? It just means that their position, why did they keep on going back for several generations to Carlisle? Which they did. It wasn't just that they were forced to go. They weren't necessarily forced to go. Okay? Other Native people were forced to go. Okay? But this was an opportunity because if you could get a degree from Hampton, you could become a mechanic and you could get a job that you might help your family. Like Chapman Skennerdo, like him. You could get a skill that you needed to survive. Okay? Of course, women's education there was very, very limited. And I've read all of the outing reports down at Hampton involving Seneca women. It's not a pretty picture when it comes to women, because they're put in positions, for example, of laundress, of maids, housekeepers in Rhode Island, at the mansions in Rhode Island. That's their outing experience to make them learn about culture. That's the way it was. But Pratt is a misunderstood. His records at Yale are terrific. The records at Yale, and the records at Yale, Archiquette's records at Yale, which you have now copied here, they're terrific. Oh yeah, also, we think of military men, they're the enemy of the... General Crook was here as a reformer trying to stop the violence. General Crook. The Silver Fox, the Apaches called him. He's the one that got the Apaches released from prison on Governor's Island. But coming here in the late 1880s and pleading for those release. Okay, and then two policy makers who purposely, no, this is true. The conferences were also used by individuals trying to corrupt the direction of Indian policy, as it says. Okay, they weren't just, misguided, benevolent people that attended. If you were a congressman, oh yeah, you could come, sure. If you had status, you could come, They didn't question your attitude. Edward Vreeland, he was Teddy Roosevelt's friend, head of the House Banking Committee. Power, Of course he's going to come here, right? And look what he's advocating. See? So notice what I'm trying to say. This became a forum for people to manipulate. Please note that. It wasn't just the evil of individuals all across the board. It was the idea that these, at times, naive individuals, and not only naive, but also misguided, and at times with racial attitudes of the time, could be manipulated by these types of people. I mean, the Reverend Walker, one of the great clergymen of the time, opposed allotment because he had seen what had happened in Minnesota. He had been in Minnesota under Bishop Whipple, and he had seen what had happened there. And he became a strong advocate. Notice the Protestant Episcopal Church. From Buffalo. He helped save Seneca lands. And of course, there were people like this who showed up. One of the worst characters in the history of indigenous people in North America. You ask any Native person who's knowledgeable about their history in Canada, they'll say he was the worst. He was much worse than Dawes. I mean, he really was awful, just awful. He's the one that you saw the exposure of the institutional schools in Canada. He's responsible. He is personally responsible, this man, for what happened. Okay. Guess what? He shows up here. And here's our Wisconsin Oneidas and Lake Mohonk. See there? There's our nice picture, Wisconsin Oneida, see? But you have to, this was 65,400 acres. In order to get out of town, meaning out of central New York, they said, oh yeah, well, by 1838, you got 65,400 acres. They didn't tell the Menominee that. But yeah, you can have that, okay. Right. But that was where the reservation is and was. Today there's approximately 40,000 acres. Notice also, and there's a misconception here, the Oneidas had to buy back their land with the casino money that they made. So when you say, "Oh, we don't, Indians should have casinos," oh yeah. So if they're going to wait for the government to give the land back, right? It doesn't work that way in this country. You know what I mean? New York, do you know that New York State? Because I worked on Indian land claims for the Senecas and Cayugas. How many acres did the state ever give back to the Haudenosaunee people? You know how many? 51 acres. And it was called the Cuba Lake case that I was the expert witness on. Right. That was a win because that was Scanyadeo's land. That was Handsome Lake's land. It was the prophet's land. So, so even though it's small, the Senecas accepted it because at least they got the Handsome Lake's land back. Petroleum site, it's medicinal petroleum that the prophet used. Handsome Lake, Scanyadeo. Okay. This is a little outdated a little bit. Okay, there's more filled in, but this is okay. Now it's 40,000. The Oneidas are so smart too. They understood things like, for example, in the 1960s, they had a parcel of land in Green Bay, Wisconsin, that wasn't allotted. It was a dockstead land, and instead of dispersing it or whatever to heirs, the tribe kept that land. And today it's a major shopping center with a Walmart and with a small casino there, which is profitable. See, so why can't Native people be economically successful? I don't see anything wrong with it, And that's why I was always amazed by the leadership there, I mean, it was really different than New York. The similarities and the differences. And among the Oneidas is this level of planning that has been going on for at least 60 years now, that has regenerated a community. More power to them. And there's Denison Wheelock, who I talked about already. And if you go to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, you'll see this music stand. It's called the Denison Wheelock Music Stand, named after this famous musician, on the site of the boarding school, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This is Oneida. This is the church that was $16,000 it cost to build this church in the 1880s, okay? Who gave the money for this church? I found out 3 days ago. I called our friend Judy. I said I found how the church, much of the church was funded by Susan Fenimore Cooper, the daughter of James Fenimore Cooper. I found it. The fact, okay? Appleton Crescent, 1890. It's right there. They say, well, it's his wife. No, it's not his wife. It's his daughter. But it's the family of James Fenimore Cooper. Isn't that interesting? It's considered to the Episcopal Church nationally. This is called, and I say this to you, the Indian Cathedral. That's how beautiful this church is. Right. The Indian Cathedral. That's what in the Episcopal archives. It's called the Indian Cathedral, American Indian Cathedral. There's some of the missionaries, some of whom came here. Why do they come here? You see Father Merrill in white. He's a white robe, right? Father Merrill came here to raise money for the mission. He would come frequently to Mohonk. And you could see him in the records at Haverford. Here you could see it. Merrill, okay? Where do you fundraise for the Episcopal Church? Well, where there are wealthy people and where they are mostly Episcopal. Yeah, beside Quaker, but mostly Episcopal, really. Major Josiah Paltz, with the money from the Episcopal Church and the support of Eastern philanthropists, he went to what is now Marquette University Medical School. Josiah Paltz is one of the great heroes of Oneida history. He died in World War I as a doctor trying to save 3 other soldiers crossing into no man's land. The 3rd time he crossed over to no man's land, he was shot 1 month before the armistice and died. He won the Distinguished Service Medal, and the Oneidas today are working on trying to get him the Congressional Medal of Honor. Okay, that's a really good effort too. He should have the Congressional Medal of Honor. These were the nurses who were funded by the reformers. Nancy Cornelia Skenendorf, the first Native American woman trained as a nurse, graduate of the Hartford Training School for nurses. And there's Sybil Carter, who was pictured at the beginning, who was the missionary who established the lace-making project. Here's a brochure from the Smithsonian in New York City, a brochure that I found showing the women, including Josephine Hill Webster in the middle, right towards the middle, showing the brochure that for selling of the lace to raise money for the community. If you didn't think I was telling the truth, this is from, as it says, the New York Herald, Sunday, April 9th, 1913. Look what it says. It says, a set of altar linen made by Indian women for Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Okay? That's the Oneida lace. And you can go, it's worth visiting the cathedral, because it's magnificent. The cathedral is magnificent. But making an appointment to see the lace sometime, if you're ever in New York City, it's really, it's something. I had to go to the Smithsonian, the Hewitt Museum there on Fifth Avenue, which is a textile museum, and they sent me up to the cathedral. It was a great day. And these are the pieces. This is some of the pieces. Chalice, okay. Notice I put the credit line, right? I don't want to get into trouble. Credit line. Okay, but this is the Oneida lace. And we're almost finished. And see this lady, her name is Betty McLester, see? This is like taken 10 years ago, maybe 8 to 10 years ago. She died 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But she tried to revive lace making because it was so important to her grandmother's generation that they were trying to revive it. They haven't succeeded yet, but that doesn't mean that there's still interest. And the museum at Oneida has examples of it as well. It's see, why can't Northern European lace be Oneida? See? It takes a different path, different tradition. It's not, cultures are not static, right? They evolve, they change over time. And the Oneidas know that better than most people. And that's it. But I thank, first of all, I want to thank Mohonk for allowing me to do this. And I thank Michelle and, for arranging this trip. Tomorrow, we have to go to the New York State Archives and State Museum. I'm on the Archives Commission, okay? So that's called a advisory committee. And so I arranged the documents to be shown there and for me to be interviewed there. But also the State Museum has a specialist who is very informed about Native American art, and some of the collections we'll see behind the scenes. Hopefully, that would be nice. But you see, you can't hide history. You know, everything comes out eventually. Even Trump. Hopefully, okay. Everything will come out. You know, maybe it takes a long time to come out, but it should be looked at. You can't take things out of complete context. You know, you admit what is wrong and what failed, and you go on and you try to do better. I tell Michelle, I said, I made a mistake in one book with 3 photos. I admit it, you know. I put the wrong caption to the photos, not because of I'll take blame. I'm not going to blame the person that gave me the photos, okay? But, so what happens is that history and knowledge hopefully gets better and gets more complete, whatever. And I feel very taken back because that's not what's happening in our country today. We have this cartoonish view of the world. We don't understand how everything is interconnected, for example, you know? And it bothers me a lot, you know? And I see that, you know, years ago, in the 1970s, I had a friend who was an anthropologist. He said, you have to speak to the people themselves. So I went out. I was naive, so I went out and did it, you know. But I always went where I was invited, you know. And but today, despite the fact, people are just writing from the documents without knowing, breaking bread, without having any type of relationship with the people they're writing about. Okay, that bothers me. When I first started, I was looked at strange because I was a historian that did field work, not only archival research but field work. You know, you're not a historian. You're an anthropologist. Well, maybe that was a good thing they told me. I said, okay. I was in a graduate course in 1868 with a very, you might know the name, June Nash. June Nash. She's a radical feminist, and it was a seminar in her apartment. There were five graduate students, and I was one of the 5 graduate students. And I said to her, how come historians don't do field work? She said, well, I don't know. I said, well, how do they understand what if the person writing the document has any authority, represents the community? Because I said to her, you know, that most of the people that write to Washington are lunatics, complaining about something. But that doesn't make them a leader or a voice of a community. How do you know? Unless you understand kinship, right? Unless you understand who's connected to whom. One of the first things I did was on a Seneca woman who was accused of being a communist and a Nazi, the worst things by the Franklin Roosevelt administration. So I found out in the FDR library, I found one of her letters in which she speaks beautifully about the need that Roosevelt should do this and that for Native people. So, but she's accused in the published accounts of, and also the correspondence in the archives, of being a lunatic, a Nazi. Okay. So I knew these Senecas. They invited me up to Cattaraugus, and I interviewed the community. Right. 3 women took me in and cross-examined. What do you want to know about this woman? You know, like. Because she was a live one and considered to be radical, and they didn't want anybody to deal with it. You know, I said, well, the life seems so strange. She's a syndicated journalist who's on the drop-dead list from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and she's accused of being all of these things. How come? What is this here? Well, so I found out that her aunt Pauline was still alive. Herrillos is still alive. Her uncle was the president of the Seneca Nation, right? The president, and that she was a lobbyist for the Seneca Nation, right? Right, and that her two nephews today, one is deceased now, are the economic advisors of the Seneca Nation, Senecas, right? Who worked on Wall Street. I said, well, what is this? What am I doing here? Yeah, but how could you got to understand. That's why I love to come to your community, you know? Because I would get to the diner, a diner, Mother's, remember Mother's, right? Mother's Diner, or Mother's, right? Right at the junction there. Mother's Diner. I would sit there with Mother's Diner half of the day, and people would come in, and Gordy would be there for a while, and then Jerry Hill and other people would come by, and I'd just sit there listening, and people would introduce themselves, and I would sit there and get an understanding of what was going on, you know, and that was really helpful, right? Very helpful. And I wasn't spying, you know, I wasn't doing anything related to today so much as finding out about the 1930s where I started, namely the Indian New Deal. So I'd like to say, Yahweh, I thank you all for listening. And although I can't hear today for some reason, I don't know if I spoke loud or spoke soft. Okay? Oh, okay.
I have a question.
Sure, please.
So when you were doing history, you were doing the history conferences
Yes.
here.
Uh-huh.
So how long? I mean, how long did it take you, like, organize and then figure out, like, well who's going to come and talk? And
well, what happened is I started 1971, and Jake Thompson, you know, do you remember that name? He was my buddy. Okay, he was Jack Campisi's buddy, and Jack invited him, and he became my buddy, you know. And Jake was a wonderful fellow. He was a Mohawk, adopted by the Oneidas. He became the voice of the Oneida claim in the early days of the claim, working with Loretta, okay, and also the people up in Canada, okay. So Jake came and he gave a spellbound. I mean, never heard a talk like that. 150 people. Listen, he says in 1971, you know what? We filed a case for 244,000 acres of central New York, and we're going to win. And these people in the audience, you know, the local people from here, you know, the college students and local people say, who is this man? Is he crazy? Right. That was Jake. He went around and gave these talks all over the country. His petitions are all over the country. The Johnson Library, the Kennedy Library, you name them, about Oneida right to land, which of course they never recognized. The great Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she denied the Oneida claim. She wrote the opinion to deny the Oneida claim. It wasn't just the conservatives, okay? And so why do you think the Oneidas are smart enough to realize that they had that they faced the wall, and they had to find another way out to reclaim their community, which they always wanted to do since this period, right? So they got involved. The person that I worked with, his name was Norbert Hill Sr., got the idea by going to Florida to see the Seminoles, because they started gaming. The Seminoles started gaming. They started bingo back in the 70s, okay, late 70s. He went there, he said, you know, they don't do it right. I loved them. Yeah, they don't do it right. Well, what do I mean? What do you mean that, Mr. Hill, what do you mean? Chairman, what do you mean? He said, they only take 25% profit. When we do it in our athletic building there, in building 2, I guess.
the Civic Center.
The Civic Center. When we will start it, he says to me, we're going to take 75%. Yeah. Norbert Hill Sr. was a Golden Gloves boxer. He worked for Walter Reuther as a United Automobile Workers enforcer. He came out of Detroit as his mother was one of the great Native Americans in the history of this country, a physician. Okay? Lily Rosa Minoka Hill, her name is. Okay, great family. These people are terrific. And he's not going to put, he and Irene Moore, and of course there were others, they decided to keep this land in Green Bay and hold on to it and never let it go until the right time. And then they would rent it out. And the right time was the late 80s, I guess. Yeah. When the Oneidas, when Brown County wanted to build an airport, this is true, this is something that you should put on film. When Brown County wanted to build an airport, they didn't ask the Oneidas. What they did is they built an airport, right, that impinged on the reservation because they didn't have the right maps and they didn't give a shit anyway. Okay, so they built part of the runway on the reservation. So the Oneidas show up and say, "You're building on lands. You got a deal here. You got a deal here. You have to compensate us for that." So what happened is that the Radisson built a hotel, the major hotel at the airport. Well, we'll give you the exclusive right to build a hotel there. We'll advertise in the airport. We're not dealing with children here, okay? I think that's the worst stereotype of all. That some of the smartest people I ever met were Senecas, Mohawk. Actually, a Mohawk man, his name was Artie Benedict. He was related to Kay. He's Kay's uncle, Kay Olin's uncle. He was chief. He was a chief. He was a smart man. Boy, brilliant. He went to St. Lawrence University. He graduated high school at 15. They wouldn't admit him to St. Lawrence until the next year, so he went anyway. And he didn't open a book because he listened to every word. He got all A's. He had William Fenton's anthropology course there. Fenton told me he never opened a book. Whatever. But that's how the federal government, and especially the state government of New York, because her people are affected by New York. In some cases, even more than Wisconsin historically. They filed suit as early as the 1860s for water rights in New York and for land, or 3 parcels of land during the Civil War, 1867. Okay, these litigation didn't just all of a sudden come up like that. They've been going on for years, and except now because of the decision in the Sherrill case, they're wiped out for a generation. They'll come back. There are ways to bring them back eventually. This is not the right time, obviously, in terms of American government to deal with Washington. Stay that way. As we know, what I'm just trying to say to you is that I've been privileged to work with some, like Gordy and Betty McBlester, with special people. And I've, from the St. Lawrence River to Duck Creek, and whatever. Yeah. They gave me the name there, Iwadogesta, Seneca, which he straightens the words. That's a beautiful name. Yeah, he straightens the words. Because that's what I do, I guess. I told you I'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write for 5 hours and then quit. because I'm all burnt out by then, you know. Then I got to take a walk if I have enough energy. But so I thank Michelle. I thank Patty here. I thank you for helping me here, and Brian, of course. And yeah, I've had good memories here, and I say I owe a lot to, and I say that I owe a lot not only to Patty, but to her mother, who was a great lady. Her mother was a great lady. She always gave me that big smile when I came here. She was always a beautiful smile, and she always encouraged my coming up. You know, when are you coming up? You know, and of course, Key smiling. So he just happened to. He understood this world. He understood what I just told you. And in fact, he would have liked to heard this. Okay. Yahweh. Okay. I should have said at the beginning, Seguli, or I should, you know, Seguli, hello. You know. But now I'm saying, Yahweh, thank you.